Randy, I seen you posted on Facebook that you had a book coming out, that you had gathered up a bunch of Carl von Mueller's information and put it all together in a book and had it available for people. And I know that Carl von Mueller had a lot of great things out there. You know, he had several books, but a lot of his stuff was in newspaper articles, magazine articles, and just scattered all over the place. And unless you really knew where to get it, you know, it's hard to come by. And so, man, that's why I was really intrigued when you said that you had it put together. And so, man, tell me a little bit about your research on Carl, how you came about putting all this information together and all that, because there was so much out there that, man, I don't know how you did that. It had to cost you a lot of time and money to do that.
I guess more to the point of your question, I'll kind of go to the back and work my way forward. I was approached, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago by our mutual friend Dan Lowe, of all people, who asked me about the Lou map. The Lou, of course, was popularized by Carl, who had published that in Treasure Hunter Manual number 7. I think he published that the first time in 1966. And I had a few articles and things laying around, but I sort of ascertained pretty quickly that if I was going to really get some information about the map, I needed to get back issues of the National Prospectors Gazette.
But
that's actually what the...
Before you go any farther, I just want to stop and say one thing that I know that you did do a ton of research on the Lou. In fact, you did a presentation for us on the Lou, and I appreciate that. In fact, I'm going to put a link to that video on here so that if people want to see your research and what you say about the Lou, they can go to that video and see it. So, okay, sorry. Continue on.
No, that's great. No, that was actually the impetus of that study that led to that presentation. Actually, Carl had published the National Prospector Gazette, and I was very fortunate. I found somebody that had about 2/3 of the issues available for a single purchase, and that was actually my first big foray into treasure hunting materials. I guess I had some books and things, small bookshelf, but I had really wanted my own sort of research library, magazines and that sort of thing, and so. That was my first step. I got those National Prospectors Gazettes and began putting together some information about the Lou, and so that was actually the book that's coming out is the first in a series of I'm thinking at least 4 books for sure.
Cool.
Which are really presenting the material from the National Prospector Gazette in a book format. So what I have. For the National Prospector Gazette is volume 6 through 12, which is 6 issues apiece. So that's 42 issues, and those ran from 1989 to I think 1983 or so. So some about 15 years. And so what I did was I had taken those, and anybody that's familiar with them, or even if you're not, they're essentially a newspaper. They are typically about 24 pages long, 4 or 5 columns, kind of small print, tough to read sometimes. I was very fortunate. The issues that I got were brand new. But what I sort of picked up on real quick was a number of things. The first was that as newspapers, they're kind of fragile.
Oh, yeah.
Even new ones, sure. Even new ones are sort of, they're easily influenced by, temperature variations or too much sunlight or not enough humidity. So I kind of realized early on that there's so much to unpack in a single issue, but I didn't want to handle them too much. They tear easy, and so I had sort of decided early on that I was going to digitize them, So I bought a hand scanner because the papers are too big for a traditional scanner, and I haven't yet found an oversized scanner. I've put out some feelers and things, but what I wanted to do was, number one, to digitize them so that I could put the originals away. The other piece to that, too, is if anything ever happened, flood or fire, that sort of thing, I would have a digital copy. I still like using a hard copy, but the advantages of the digital copy are, of course, number one, you can blow those up, and then number two, I was able to do character recognition through Adobe. So now I can do search term searches. I can do cut and paste. I can do different things. And once I realized that I could do cut and paste, I got the idea of really doing the books. I thought, the material's here, and it should be fairly easy to do it. So then I kind of thought about a format. And what I realized was that with 42 issues, Carl ran some pretty standard columns through all those issues. So the first book, which I finished and is actually available for sale now, he did what was called the Exanimo Looks at Books, which was just a basic book review column. But he did that in nearly every issue. But it was a good sort of first project. Number one, because I really like bibliographies. I really like research materials like that. So Carl had actually done a book similar to that of his own some years ago as well, called The Journals of El Dorado, who he co-wrote with S.D. Conister, who was a pretty big name in the Lost Dutchman lore. But so I thought it was a good place to start, but then I realized, there's several other columns that he ran pretty regularly. So I've actually finished the text for the second book, which is an Ask Exanimo, was a column that he ran where readers would send in questions about different things. And so I've gathered all of those into a second book. And then I'm planning a third book, which I've just started checking out, which will be feature columns. So most of the MPGs had like a feature story or several long stories that either Carl himself wrote or people that he was affiliated with wrote. And then I will likely do a fourth book. It'll probably be a little bit of a combination of things. He had a regular dowsing column for quite a while, and then he also had one called Tips for Prospectors, which are kind of like hacks. We talk about life hacks now, and so Carl was big about being self-sufficient, and so he dedicated a column to how to make your own things, how to make your own, soap or detergent, or how to reproper different things for different uses. So it's kind of an interesting column, but it's a standalone. There wasn't quite enough material for a whole book. So once I've done that, I'll have to sort of evaluate the next step. But that will cover a pretty good chunk of the MPG's material. Now, a lot of what would remain, he did a lot of, he printed a lot of stuff from other people, but he didn't always answer letters. And I haven't decided if I want to try to print those or not, but right. I have some other projects to work on. So, but no, I learned reading the MPGs. Of course, again, those came out a number of years before I was even born, and I realized when I started reading them that a lot of what he was writing was still relevant. And he wrote on such a wide variety of things, everything from, metal detecting to basic prospecting and small mining operation, cash hunting, books, obviously, research. Carl wrote about a little bit of everything, so it makes for some interesting reading. And the other piece is there's a lot of utility for a variety of different people. So part of what I wanted to do when I started was really sort of preserve this stuff in a format that would endure. But I think my overall goals have sort of spread a little. I realized that sort of as a generation, Carl Carl's been passed away now for almost 25 years. And I'd like to do something to sort of honor his name. Some people still recognize it, but the treasure hunting community has really shifted since Carl was really prominent. So I think, number one, what he wrote, a lot of it still has value and merit. And then number two, I'd like to honor him and by making some of this stuff available again. So.
Well, and I just want to say, that's what excited me about when I found out that you was doing this, is that you was preserving it, because, like you said, a lot of this was written on newspapers, newspaper format, which, got tossed out. There's not a lot of that around anymore. The magazines get tossed out, and for people to try and find that stuff nowadays just isn't that easy. So, that's what got me excited, that you are preserving this and making it available to the public. So,
yeah, certainly. Yeah, and like I said, a lot of the things Carl was writing about, it's funny, there's a lot of parallels to sort of our current culture. Carl wrote a lot about, he called it owl hooting, which at the time was really sort of living out of your RV, a mobile home or whatnot. And so he wrote a lot of articles about, how to make money while you're on the road, how to deal with things like your mail. And there's a lot of it's very similar to like, what we would talk about like preppers now, that sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
And Carl talked a great deal about, preparing yourself for economic upheaval, being sort of diversified in what you were doing. But he also talked a lot about how you make a living doing things that you enjoy. And of course, Carl sort of typified that. He made a heck of a living as a writer. He made a heck of a living as a prospector and as a treasure hunter, and sharing what he knew with people. And what you learn really quickly too, researching Carl, is that he was I don't know how he wrote as much as he did. He had the NPG alone would have taken up a huge amount of time, because he's writing the articles, he's setting the type for the printer, he's trying to meet a schedule. And in the meantime, he's publishing his own books. He used his establishment as a printing agent for others. He was also a voracious letter writer. I've seen at least 24 letters, and I know by talking to people that he wrote fairly frequently.
Huh.
Plus, he was engaged in his own treasure projects, and one of the unintended but really awesome consequences of the NPG is that I also learned that from about 1965 to 1975. Treasure hunting was really taking off as a hobby. Metal detectors were really improving. They were also getting less expensive and much more easily obtained. And so the consequence of that was that there was a real glut on treasure hunting materials. So glossy magazines, the kind of things you would buy on the newsstand, but also newsletters. So a lot of clubs and a lot of individuals sort of started their own. So the NPG probably stands out as the best of those sorts of things. But there were several that ran for many years. There was one out of California by a guy named Johnny Pounds called the Treasure Hunter. That ran for about the same time that the NPG did. There was a great club in Texas, Prospector Club International. They had a fantastic newsletter that ran for about 10 or 12 years. And then of course you had a real movement with magazines. The forerunner to Western Eastern Treasures began in 1965, and then in the 1970s you had Treasure World and True Treasure, which would end up being those would ultimately merge and become Lost Treasure, which is still available. But around there in the early 1970s, there was, I don't know, probably about a dozen different treasure magazines. And up till that point, treasure stories appeared largely in Western magazines and in men's magazines, things like Saga and the Argosy, and so you see a real shift there with the popularity of metal detectors, and then with treasure literature. So
Yep.
I've been very fortunate. I've got about 4,000 magazines. And then I got a pretty good collection of these different newsletters and things, and then the quality varies from one to the other. But what you also see is Carl wrote for a lot of those too. He would do articles, and then you see a trend with his Ask Exanimo column, which he ran in several other papers. But he also did that with Western and Eastern Treasures for about 12 years too. So he always had his hands in a number of different things, and if you look through some of these other papers, you see where he was, sending in letters and articles and just really contributing. And so you sort of see a loose kind of brotherhood from the same time period with the people that Carl would talk about and how they would sort of cross-promote one another's papers and periodicals. By mentioning them by name. Well, it's not the kind of thing you see now.
Right.
So a lot of this is, scratch your back, scratch my back kind of thing. But it's pretty interesting.
What can you tell us about Carl? Any interesting treasure stories? Any, who was Carl von Mueller? For these people that have never heard, the new people getting into treasure hunting who've never heard of Carl von Mueller, tell us a little bit about him, his life, his what he did, some of the adventures he went on, and maybe even a little bit about the Lou.
Well, boy, that's a lot to unpack too. I think it's really important that I sort of remind folks that I never had any interactions with Carl. I was still in high school when he passed away, and I really wouldn't catch wind of kind of his contributions to treasure hunting for quite a while. I've been fairly lucky in locating a number of people that he did business with or worked with. Again, the National Prospector Gazette had a fairly substantial readership at one point, and so it's not hard to find people that wrote him or talked to him or swapped letters or phone calls with him. And that's kind of a funny thing too. I found myself reading the National Prospector Gazette and really sort of, it was an odd sensation. I found myself very nostalgic for a time period that I never was a part of. Carl came from a time when, party lines are still being used on the phone. There was no computers.
I remember them days. I remember the party lines. Yeah, I remember them days.
Sure. And so towards the latter part of his paper writing career, Carl was really talking a lot about the benefits of microfiche, if that says anything.
Yep.
So you think now about advances in computers, and like I said, he passed away in '91, I believe. So he just barely missed sort of the birthing of the internet age. As best I can surmise, Carl got started into treasure hunting fairly young. I want to say probably in his late teens or early 20s. He has written a number of pieces about doing some early treasure hunting in Nebraska and Iowa, I believe. And of course, back then, that would have been, the late 1920s or 1930s, as I recall. I think there were some very early metal detectors, but people, treasure hunters were not using them. Treasure hunters in that period were really, they did their research, which of course is something else Carl is, a big proponent of. He talks a great deal about doing proper research and things. But
it's all about proper research. Yeah. Yep.
Well, sure. And that's kind of one of his big things was number one, that he didn't have a lot of faith in a lot of the big treasure stories. He was very critical the Lost Dutchman and the Lost Adams and those kind of stories. But his real thing was, take them or leave them. The reality is, every community has hundreds, if not thousands, of their own treasure stories. And he's not talking about, mines full of, gold bars. He's talking about, the farmer that, stuck his, yearly earnings in a post hole in a cement line, or
yep, and that was prevalent, especially after the Depression. People were afraid to put their money in the banks or these small communities, where they didn't have banks, and so
absolutely,
and some of that. I ran across some people that have found some of these small caches. Back in the 30s and 40s, they were huge caches to them, but nowadays they're small caches, but because of the oldness, the numismatic value of the coins, it's a huge fortune. I mean, not a huge fortune, but these guys squirreled away pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters. It wasn't $100 bills and that, because pennies, dimes, nickels, quarters, that was a lot of money back then. But those some of them pennies, dimes, and quarters and nickels and them are worth some money today because of the numismatic value.
Absolutely. And then Carl was quick to point that out. Even back then, that coin collectors placed a value on things that other people didn't. He was constantly sort of encouraging people to know what they had before they sold it. But that was kind of one of his hallmarks. This idea that these big stories you hear in the magazines or whatnot. Well, a lot of those stories have been embellished. They've been retold. There's not a lot of meat to the details. But, these little treasures, they're everywhere. Not only are they everywhere, but they're constantly, there's always new ones being introduced, because hiding money is something people still do. So what Carl did back then, as best I can tell, he had a regular partner who was, I believe he was a police officer or a sheriff. They would go into a house, an abandoned house, and they would, check things like, door jambs and loose boards and pipes and chimney flues and different things, where they had sort of learned that people predictably would hide treasure. He also would work different sites along, like the Pioneer Trails. As I understand it, Carl had a probe that he would use. It was just basically a metal rod that, he would jam into the ground, and if he, hit metal or hit a pocket of something, then they would know maybe to dig it up. But he had a good eye for, looking at the lay of the land or whatnot, and sort of predicting where people might have stayed or might have camped or may have hidden stuff. So he kind of cut his teeth on that. And then I know he moved around quite a bit early on. I know he turns up in California. And of course, when he's in California in the 50s, he became friends with Hard Rock Hammond, who is sort of credited with introducing the Lou to the public. Hammond was an older gentleman then, probably in his 60s and the 50s. He would pass away in 1968, I believe. But Carl wrote quite a bit about him and what he learned working with him. Of course, by the 50s, you start to see some metal detector use, but again, those devices were large. They were using, I think, radio tubes. They were temperamental and not particularly sensitive, I don't think, but in terms of putting you ahead of what you already had, it was a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
And then, so in the 1950s, Carl, that's when he actually starts the original National Prospectors Gazette. I mentioned earlier that I had volume 6 through 12. Well, he had actually done a volume 1 through 5. He had started those, I think, in 1954. And if you do a Google search, you'll see where he ran some ads in like Popular Mechanics and Time, I think. And I have not seen any of those issues. Carl ran those from 1954 to the early 1960s. And then
So those
I
those
believe
those issues, you've looked for them and have not been able to find them.
that is correct.
So if I just want to say then, if anybody out there hears this and they know how to get a hold of some of them issues, let us know.
That would be fantastic. And in fact, in volume 1 of my book, which I put out, I actually have indicated I've left my name and email address and phone number in the copyright page, because that was something else I was hoping to do with publishing the book, is to reach out. I've sort of learned that there are a number of people that collect this kind of stuff, but they're not real. They typically don't advertise, so finding people that have this stuff is kind of difficult. Once in a while, I see some stuff go up for sale on the internet, stuff that got picked up at an estate sale or whatnot. But as you kind of indicated earlier, finding the old newspapers and things is pretty hard. People run across those and they tend to throw them out compared to like a magazine or a book where they may see some resale value or something. And then again, like I said, the newspapers just don't hold up well over time either. So I'm absolutely in the market for any of that kind of stuff. One contemporary of Karl von Mueller's was a man named Gene Ballinger. He published 4 or 5 different newspapers. I would be interested in talking to anybody about trading, buying, selling any kind of treasure newspapers or newsletters from clubs, those kind of things. But so yeah, Karl started with the NPG, and as far as I can tell, that's probably one of the earliest magazines that he was involved with. He stopped running that. I believe he moved from California to Salt Lake City, and then he briefly published a paper when he was there called the Adventure Bulletin. And I think that one only ran maybe 5 or 6 issues. And then he turns back up in Nebraska, I believe, and he starts publishing another newspaper called the Exanimo Express. And that one ran for, 6 or 7 issues. And then he stops publishing that and starts publishing the National Prospectors Gazette again, and then, of course, picks up that one where he left off with the original. I'm not sure of all the details of why he didn't just stick with one paper. I'm assuming a lot of that's tied into his movement. Of course, then he does the National Prospectors Gazette, and he moves to Segundo, Colorado, which is down on the New Mexico border, and that's where he published most of the National Prospector Gazettes from 69 to 83, and then he sort of stayed put. So he had his hand in a number of different publications there for a while. He also had a publication. He had a professional treasure hunting group, I guess you'd call it, called the Circle of Companions, and they had a newsletter for a while as well. And I've never seen any of those, so I'm definitely in the market for Circle of Companions material. Or he was affiliated with a group in California called the Prospectors Club of Southern California, I believe it was, and they're actually still an active group. But I know they had a newsletter of some sort in the 60s, 70s. I'd be interested in copies of those as well. But if anybody's interested, they can email me or contact me on YouTube there or whatnot. I've got a list of things that I'm specifically looking for. But one of the weird things about collecting something like treasure material is you don't always know what you don't have until somebody shows you that you don't. You know what I mean?
Right.
So Karl settled down in Colorado, and he, of course, by then he's published Treasure Hunter's Manual 6 and 7, which he published both of those in the 1960s, and then later Rand Publishing, which was affiliated with I can't remember if it's White's or Garrett's Metal Detectors.
It's affiliated with Garrett.
Yeah, so they picked up the copyrights to those, and then they republished them. But it's interesting because if you compare RAM versions to the originals. There's actually quite a few differences. So there's always a market for different versions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, interesting story. Treasure Hunter Manual 6, which I think came out in 61 or 62. There's like 4 or 5 versions of that. The original version is a real collector's item. Carl had published that with an appendix in it that had names and addresses of treasure hunters that he knew, or treasure hunters that he had corresponded with. So there's a huge list of, it's 20 or 30 pages of names and addresses, but they only ran that in the first edition because there was, I don't know if they're substantiated enough. There were rumors that people had used those names and addresses to burglarize people that they knew were treasure hunters and steal coins or relics or whatever. So subsequent versions of that did not include that appendix. So that's kind of an interesting item. It's kind of interesting too because Carl talks a lot about the importance of anonymity. Particularly as it related to not broadcasting your finds. Number one, because the government, they always, want their percentage. But the other piece is, Carl sort of learned or heard enough from others who would learn the hard way that anytime you recover something, there's always people that are sort of lining up to claim it was theirs or
Yep.
belong to their family. And so Carl definitely sort of endorsed the idea of keeping your finds quiet. He did not actually publish a lot of his own recoveries. I only know of one for sure, and that's actually a pretty interesting story. Carl, at one point in the National Prospectors Gazette, Carl is selling, you could see the ads plain as day, he's selling these silver arrowheads on a silver chain. And I believe there's a very brief mention in one of the NPGs where he talks about how him and a partner of his, a guy named Montana Larry Campbell, had made a recovery not far from his home in Segundo, as I understand it. They had gone up in the mountains and found a cave with these, he called them silver slugs. I'm not quite sure how they were made, but that was how he decided to liquidate them. And Carl wrote a lot about that too, this idea that, people have this idea that finding treasure is going to somehow solve their problems, when in reality what it's really doing is opening the door to a whole lot of
Oh, big time! It's opening the door to the riffraff coming after you to try and get it from you. There's all kinds of stories, not all kinds of stories, but there is stories out there of people getting caught and tortured to say where their treasure is, where they found it, where it's at, all that. And so because of that, because of the riffraff out there, the bad element out there. When people find things or do, unless you personally know them and they're friends and trustworthy to them, you'll never know. You'll never know about these things being made. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of bore up historically. One doesn't have to look any farther than Mel Fisher and the Apache. He spent 20 years trying to find a treasure and another, 10 trying to keep it.
Yep.
The minute he made a recovery,
everybody was there. The government, everybody was there with their hands out to get it. Yep.
Sure. So that was sort of one of his cautions. So it's interesting that most of the stories you hear about Carl and recoveries are sort of second and third hand, a lot of innuendo and things. But that's one that's pretty easy to verify because he said that and he had the silver and he was selling the necklaces. So. It was a pretty ingenious way of sort of offloading that material and avoiding some issues. You mentioned the Lou. Now, there's a lot of persistent rumors about Carl making a recovery. Carl himself sort of hints, if you read enough of the Lou material, that he makes it very clear that he had in fact solved the Lou. Or at least a part of it. He sort of came to the conclusion that the Lou actually indicated more than one cache sites spread out over a fairly large geographical area. But Carl did a biographical sketch for a man named A.T. Evans. I mentioned the Prospector Club International earlier out of Odessa, Texas. A.T. Evans was the president and printed that for, I don't know, about 48 issues or so before he sold it off. But in his biographical sketch, Carl indicated that he had solved the Lou in '58. So one can surmise that at some point he made the recovery. Now, like my understanding, he made that in northern New Mexico, a place called Black Lake. He indicated he had a partner, but I've never pinned down for sure who that partner was. 58 would have been probably ample time for him and Hard Rock Hammond to have done it. And then I've also alternatively heard that Montana Larry Campbell, who he made that silver recovery with, may have been involved with that. Carl talked about several large treasures and included the Lou in this, that he sort of indicated that were so large that people that had found them sort of used them as a bank. They would take what they could carry and come back periodically as they needed it. And he kind of indicated that his Lou cache they had found sort of fell into that. My understanding is he had found enough gold to fill the back of a pickup truck with, but again, this is stuff that came from people that have heard it over the years or whatnot. Carl was fairly short-lived about it. He said he solved the Lou. He never indicated anything himself about recovering anything from it. But that's actually interesting too, because if you read the newspapers, there's sort of a funny. You can kind of pick up a vibe about different things. So, Carl, the first NPG Volume 6, Number 1, Carl has a cover story by a man named Fred Dorick. Fred Dorick would actually write a book, I don't know, 2 or 3 years later, talking about different treasure sites. And Dorick actually writes about the Lou and sort of indicates that he felt like it was something that Carl had made up. And I bring that up because in those early issues, Carl, he starts writing about the Lou. Carl also had a feature article in True Treasure, which at the time was owned by, his name was John Latham. John Latham owned True Treasure and Treasure World.
Yep.
And he would eventually put those together as the Lost Treasure magazine. He did that in '68, but up until then, he ran 2 different magazines on odd and even months. But they sort of, John Latham, they called him Long John. He ran a big cover story about the Lou. It was printed by a guy named Tom Hilton, I think his name was.
Yep, it was Tom Hilton.
Yeah, and Hilton, he was very critical of the Lou too. He actually goes to where Carl is alleged to have recovered the treasure in Black Lake, New Mexico. And it was a very large article, like 8 or 9 pages, compared to what you see now, which are usually like, 12 or 1,300 words. But what's interesting is Hilton talks a lot about the Lou, but he never mentions anything about Carl directly, even though it's sort of clear that this article is like an expose. Carl, up to that point, had been writing I believe it was an Ask Exanimo column, but I think he called it Carl's Corner for True Treasure, and then that abruptly stops. And then what you see is that when you're reading the MPGs and you're reading the Treasure World and True Treasures, they're both sort of talking about one another. So it sort of looks like Carl and John Latham had a falling out over the Lou, and they sort of use that as a pretext to sort of talk about one another. But as far as
that's
Carl,
interesting, because I know that there were several people that thought the Lou was a ruse made up by Carl, and they wanted to publish it in the treasure hunting magazines, but they wouldn't publish it because they didn't want the bad publicity of saying anything bad about Carl.
That's an interesting thing. I've talked to everybody from Carl's editor, who was a man named Paul Tinker. Probably knew him better than anybody. Paul actually was one of the ones that gave me permission to do the book. I've talked to probably 24 people that knew Carl, had done business with Carl, talked with Carl. And the one thing that I found very consistent is the only people that have ever sort of suggested that Carl was dishonest or would have made a joke like that are people that didn't know him. And again, he's been passed away for 25 years. People don't. I think that if that were the case, it would have kind of came out by now. That was the other thing too. I've heard that case made too, that the Lou was sort of a fabrication. Carl talks about the Lou an awful lot, and he refers to it. He refers to it for years and years and years. And I'm thinking, if I made up a joke, I would not probably. The harder you work to keep it kind of in the forefront of people's minds, the higher the likelihood is that somebody's going to expose it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
So it's hard for me to imagine that he would roll that out. The other thing too is when he first publishes that in Treasure Hunter Manual 7, there's nothing there but the map. There's a little blurb at the bottom of the map,
yep.
But there's nothing. There's no story to it. There's no explanation of why he's publishing it in the book or how he came to have it. And frankly, if you didn't know that the Lou was a map, there's nothing about it that suggests that it's a map.
Right. Yep.
The idea that he sort of rolled this out to fool people, it just doesn't hold a lot of water. And I've heard people say, well, he wanted to sell the book. Well, Carl already had books. He was already a very successful author. Carl had already published Treasure Hunter 6. He had also Carl had several pen names, and he had published Sudden Wealth under his name. He used Deep Gladstone, which was sort of an amalgamation of his wife's name. So the idea that he was trying to sell books, again, it doesn't. He had books in print that were very successful. He had the NTG, which was very successful. And if he was trying to use that to sell 7, he didn't go about it very well, I don't think. Again, there's nothing. It wasn't presented as a selling point. It was, in fact, it's sort of an afterthought.
Yeah, it's just almost like it's just kind of stuck in there as a treasure map, Yeah,
absolutely. But that whole, I mentioned earlier that, I had a lot of nostalgia about that time period. That was kind of an interesting thing too, because you sort of have to judge a time period by its own standards. So like I've talked to people that thought it was sort of sketchy that Carl had a pen name that he published under. And what I remind people of is that number one, a lot of authors back then did that, and it wasn't to fool people. Primarily, it was because they could publish more, particularly magazine writers. If they had pen names, they could run more than one article in the same issue. There's a fairly well-known treasure author, man by the name of Maurice Kildare.
Yep.
He had well over 24 pen names that he published under, and he published at least 150 articles under Maurice Kildare alone. There's this tendency to sort of think that somebody's hiding something, but part of it goes back to this idea of how were people communicating. Well, you only had 2 primary ways of communicating back then, telephones and letters. So Carl was a fairly visible figure. He ran, of course, he called it the Exanimo establishment there in Colorado. It had started out primarily as selling metal detectors and servicing metal detectors, and of course that ended up expanding into a fairly significant printing operation where he was publishing his own books, publishing other people's books, plus he was selling books that he bought. And then he was selling, all sorts of prospecting supplies. He had developed several of his own, sluices and rocker boxes and different things for small prospecting and small miner operations. So he was a very well-known figure. Something else that I think people probably remember, but we sort of failed to sort of register. We're all on cell phones now. Nobody's paying long distance.
Yeah.
Back then, talking long distance was a big deal. So I think part of why Carl had pseudonyms was, number one, because he wanted to be able to publish things. But he didn't always, he didn't want people showing up all the time, and he already had a lot of visibility running the establishment and having his name attached to a lot of these projects. The irony, of course, is that Carl von Mueller obviously isn't even his real name. His real name is Charles Dean Miller. Carl just seems to stick. So, but he published a couple under Deke Gladstone. And he had other pen names. I'm not aware of all of them, and I'm certainly not aware of what he published under those names. But so part of it's sort of understanding that he had a certain celebrity, but at the same time he was kind of trying to do his own thing. And Carl lamented about that quite a bit in some of his writings. This idea that he's trying to operate a business, but he's also fielding phone calls constantly. He's got people dropping by and visiting him all the time, people that he's never met, but, they know where he's publishing from, and they're in that part of the country, and they want to meet Carl or get some advice, or hopefully get some tips, or maybe to leave you or whatnot. But so...
I kind of know that excuse me, I kind of know that feeling. Back when the internet was first getting going, I started that website, the Treasure Hunters Hideout, and back then it wouldn't be so cool now, but back then I had a lot of neat things on there, and a lot of people from all over the country, man, thought that I was this treasure hunting guru, and they was sending me all kinds of information and wanting me to help them and do this and that, and showing up at the doorstep, and man, I didn't have time to help them. They was a lot smarter than me, and I just wanted to do my little thing, and so I can understand why you'd kind of be anonymous, because like you said, the people show up out of the woodworks, wanting just wanting your time, your everything.
No, absolutely, and I think from what I gather, he was pretty generous with his time, but at the end of the day, he had a family, he had a business to run. He presumably had some of his own treasure projects that he was working on. Plus, he had deadlines for books he was writing. He had a regular deadline for the NPG. So that much I gather too. When people talk about his integrity or whatnot, I think sometimes the facts speak for themselves. And I think it's pretty well established that Carl really went out of his way to help people, even to his own detriment. An interesting thing there too, we mentioned earlier that a lot of times being a successful treasure hunter invites more problems. I find that a lot of these guys that were very well known also often have fairly remarkable endings. Carl was no exception. Carl had I believe it was there at Exanimo in Segundo. He had as I understand it, maybe an outbuilding. It's where he did his business. He wasn't attached to his house. But there towards the end, somebody broke into his facility. Presumably they stole, I don't know what he had there, probably, some gold nuggets or some relics or things that he'd recovered. But they not only robbed him, but they set fire to his place, and he lost his library. He lost several unpublished manuscripts, and ultimately, it's sort of a cliche, but I've heard it bore up too. He died not too long after that. I think within the next 12 or 18 months. And his wife allegedly indicated she felt like he died of a broken heart, losing his life's work essentially. And understandably took an awful lot out of it. So
Well, and that happened to a lot of. Well, I'm not going to say a lot of people, but that did happen to several people. You know, I know that Frank Fish was a famous treasure hunter, and the same thing. He had a museum, and somebody broke into his museum and stole stuff from him, and eventually killed him, trying to get his information from him. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Frank Fish is an interesting cautionary tale. Cut from very much the same cloth as Carl. Frank Fish had a big museum. He had very good luck with doing sound research and then implementing early models of the metal detector. He made one significant recovery of like a Wells Fargo box and some guns and things from a robbery. Frank Fish is an interesting story, but yes, very very similar to Carl in terms of his success. Sort of invited more trouble than he wanted to. But Carl also got interested in. Again, here's something that if you weren't around back then, I think we as in this generation are really missing out. Carl got heavily involved in again in the late '60s and the early '70s. They were running treasure hunting shows. They had a huge one that they ran several years down in Oklahoma City, a place called the Shepherd's Mall. And of course, again, it was a great opportunity for metal detector, manufacturers to, demonstrate models. Guys that were writing books, people like Carl could go there and sell books. And these shows were huge. I know at least one of the Shepherd's Mall treasure shows had a 3-day run that attracted 500,000 people.
Wow!
So these are huge shows. Now we've got, there's a regular. I know Utah gets it, and it's the same one that comes here. It's sort of a traveling like a rock hound and small mine and fossil kind of show.
Uh-huh.
But this was purely treasure hunting stuff, treasure hunting books, and of course, guys that were selling, camping and survival gear and those kind of things. But Carl got into those, and again, that's something that's sort of missing from this day and age.
Yep.
I think, and I think it's to our detriment. Not only the shows, but that period really produced a lot of guys that had a lot of personality, and so there's a certain level of celebrity. And people that had a name recognition in terms of their contributions to treasure hunting. So you had guys like Carl, and then Bill Mahan, who was an early treasure hunter. In fact, he's the first one to start publishing Treasure World. He had a lot of luck down in Padre Island in Texas before the government cut that off for metal detecting. But then you had treasure authors that did a lot of books like Thomas Penfield and Michael Paul Henson and H. Glenn Carson, a lot of those guys. And then, of course, back then there was a number of different book distributors that focused almost exclusively on treasure hunting as well. There was an outfit on the East Coast called the Foul Anchor Archives, and that was run by his last name was Neesmith. He was a treasure author as well, but he did a lot of salvage work. But he had a huge catalog of books. And then Southern Texas, there was another one. I think that was Frontier Books, and that was ran by, his name was Ed Bartholomew. He was a history professor down in Texas, but he also he was a great example of a guy. He had a pen name. Well, he penned a lot of treasure books under the name of Jesse Rasko. And my understanding with that was that he was, as a historian, he was afraid that his professional credentials might be questioned with his treasure interests. So, under the name Ed Bartholomew, he published quite a few fairly well-known biographical sketches and things. He did 2 books, I believe, on Wyatt Earp. So he turned out some pretty good stuff. But his treasure materials were really fantastic too. Jesse Rasco did 3 books: Treasure Tales, Western Treasure Tales, more Western Treasure Tales. But he was real good about going in and finding newspaper clippings and publishing those, which was really interesting because at the time it was not uncommon for people to publish things that clearly were not their own, but to fail to cite their sources. So if you compare a lot of treasure literature or a lot of magazines to books and things, you're going to find that plagiarism was not that uncommon. But again, one of the things we sort of overlooked, again, the internet makes that stuff really easy. But in the 60s or 70s, I could find a book in a library and be fairly confident that if I copied something out of it, nobody might ever connect it to.
Right. Yep.
So treasure authors, depending on who you're talking about, they were really good about presenting information, but they were very poor often about leaving a discernible trail. So trying to figure out where they got their information and following that backwards was difficult.
Right.
But so yeah, that was kind of the treasure shows. You see a lot of these books by treasure authors that are autographed. A lot of them did this right there at the show. So that was kind of a neat sort of peek back. When you read these National Prospector Gazette, number one, you see a lot of that kind of thing. Something that was very popular back then, and I think people still do it now, but not so much. They would do assaulted hunt. So like they would take like an acre of ground and they would put coins and things in it, and then you'd pay a fee to be a part of this hunt, and then whoever found the most coins or the highest dollar value or whatever, they give out trophies and you get to keep what you found and stuff. So they could do a couple things there. Number one, it was just kind of fun, but number two, the new metal detector manufacturers could, put their new models out there and people could test them and things. But so those were really popular.
Not only that, but then the people could meet each other and have some little camaraderie about that, and meet some of the people that like to doing the same things that they like doing. But I want to say one thing about you, Randy, that what I liked and appreciated you is back when the internet was really first getting going, there was a lot of us treasure hunters from Utah that was searching for, the Lost Roads mines and some other things out there. And we knew of each other and we'd talked to each other a little bit, but we never got together until you got us all together with the Treasures of Utah Forum, which, man, I really appreciate you did that, because that helped bring us all together closer and met people that some great people that I really never knew before, and so, I just want to thank you for doing that. And the sad thing about that, though, is and I know I got the same problem with the Ancient Lost Treasures, is that people have jumped to Facebook and posted on Facebook instead of these old forums. But the Facebook, the problem with that is all the messages, all the informations get pushed down to the bottom and kind of get lost, where Ancient Lost Treasures, Treasures of Utah, that stuff is there. You can go research, you can find all kinds of great information that people posted there, and people should do that. Go visit them sites, because there is a lot of great information about you name whatever, it's there. Anyways, I just want to say that I appreciate it and thank you for that, Brandy, bringing us all together.
That was an interesting project too. I'd been interested in buried treasure for a very long time. I got my first dose as a kid watching. There was an old TV show called In Search Of. It was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. They'd done an episode on the Dutchman and an episode on Oak Island, and after that, I was hooked. When I was out in Utah briefly, and that's kind of how I got wind of the Lost Roads mine. I was very lucky. I was out there in '95, going to Brigham Young, and '95 was interesting because I don't know if George Thompson had passed away or not, but he had just published that revised edition of Faded Footprints, and then of course his first book, the Spanish Trails, or I don't remember the name of it. he had several books, and they were all still in print. And of course, that was about the same time Dale Rhodes, his book Lost Gold of the Uintas had been published posthumously at the same time, and then the irony, of course, is that all those books, are sort of fetching huge prices now online.
Yep.
I just happened to be in there. I just happened to be right there at Ground Zero and all that stuff. You could go up to the BYU bookstore or go downtown to Frontier Books or whatever and just pick that stuff up.
I was
lucky I had the money.
Yeah, I remember. I used to sell metal detectors, prospecting equipment, books and stuff like that, and I had cases and cases of them books, and I wished I still had cases of them books to sell now, because they are, like you said, they're worth a lot of money.
Well, that's kind of a funny. You asked me about kind of interesting stories. Now, this is not exactly directly about Carl, but it's a pretty funny story. It's a heartbreaking story. Kind of similar to yours. I got my MPGs from a gentleman in St. Louis. I don't want to put his name out there, but he had gotten those, and I called him, and he sold me that stack. But he told me this story. I mentioned earlier that Paul Tainter was, I can't remember if he was the publisher or the editor of the National Prospector Gazette. I don't know how much of that was just in name or whatnot, but he, as I understand it, and I hope I don't screw this story up, because Paul's been real good to me, and I don't want to.
No.
Paul had gotten a hold of my contact and said, I've got a whole room full of National Prospector Gazettes, and I got to get rid of them. There's so many in here, they're cracking the floor.
Wow.
And I need to unload them. So my friend from St. Louis goes up and basically fills a truck. But he said that was literally what was there, was stacks of the National Prospectors Gazette, about as tall as a person.
Wow.
Stacks and stacks and stacks. They were leftover issues from all the print runs they had. And, of course, that's where he got the ones that he sold me. He got a bunch of them and bundled them up and shrink-wrapped them. But he couldn't take, he could only take a fraction of what was there. And he said, literally, yeah, there were so many of these newspapers, they were straining the floor. And so Paul had called and had him come pick them up. And, of course, Paul says, if you want the rest of these, you need to come back for them. And, my contact said, I got all I can use, And then Paul calls him back about a week later and tells him he donated all the leftovers to a Boy Scout newspaper drive.
They just gonna take them and recycle them, huh?
Yeah, so of course now those are worth $15-20 a copy sometimes.
Wow.
I've seen them for. So there weren't a few, But yeah, you never know, man, and there's not much point in having that stuff if you don't want to enjoy it and read it. So
right.
It's kind of a toss-up. It's interesting. You mentioned selling those books, because that's actually how you're the first person I talked to from Utah, and that's how I got to talking to you. I bought one of those books, and you sent it with a replica of a Spanish doubloon that I have down here in my basement with me.
You better hold on to that. That's worth some money, because that's made out of real silver. So that's a replica that I had made up to sell off of one of the coins that come off the Etoshan. It's made with real antique silver. So man, you got a collector's items there, because I haven't had them forever.
Yeah, I'm trying to think here. I don't know. I think there's something else I might have it, but I think as far as National Prospector Gazette and Carl, I think if you want to know more about the Lou, there's that video that, of course, I did that with you, and I've been very lucky. I've had contact with Carl's daughter. She gave me permission to do the books, and I think I've gotten to know them about as well as you can learn to know somebody without ever having met them.
Awesome.
a lot of these books and magazines, it's sort of a treasure hunt in itself,
Oh, definitely.
looking through that stuff and stumbling onto some little bit of information or some interesting story about somebody that you didn't know about, or and there's bits and pieces of Carl scattered all over the place. He
Yep.
wrote letters to True West in the 1950s, and he wrote stuff for Desert Magazine. And, the Lou and Carl are very similar in that I get to a point where I feel like I've exhausted my leads and I don't have any new information, and then suddenly something comes along and I've got some new stuff, and I get fired up about it again. And I think if I was going to hope for some things out of this interview with you, which I'm really grateful. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity, not only to get the word out there about the book, but I don't get to have conversations like this nearly often. But I would love to talk to more people that knew Carl, that corresponded with, or met, or talked regularly with Carl. I would love to hear, people's own experiences and observations and those kind of things. And then, of course, like I talked about earlier, anybody that's got materials that they want to. I would even, be interested in photocopies of things if I couldn't have the originals, just for the sake of having access to them and just having a greater awareness of some of the things that I know I'm looking for. Like I said, those Circle of Companion letters, the original MPGs. If someone's not sure, they can certainly contact me and ask me. And then again, I've got some extra stuff that I can trade with, or I'd just be happy talking about some of this stuff.
Well, cool. Randy, I'll when I post this, I'll put you kind of a moderator over this so that you can kind of interact with the people that maybe have some information or want to know more information. But some more information that I want right now is, so what is the name of this book and how do people get it?
The book is it's called Selections from the National Prospectors Gazette, Volume 1. Exanimo looks at books. If you do a Google search for National Prospectors Gazette, it'll come right up. Typically, it's one of the first entries you'll run across. I went with CreateSpace as a self-publishing print-on-demand source. Which again, it's kind of a neat setup if you've never published. Publishing's changed. There was a time when you would buy, you would pay somebody to make you 3,000 or 4,000 copies of a book, and then you were on the hook to get rid of them.
Yep.
Now I can send up a PDF, and they don't make any until somebody wants one. Doesn't cost me a penny, and the book is $20. Which, for the amount of information that's in it, it's a heck of a bargain. Again, this first book is Looks at Books, which is the book review column. In it, I have there's over 400 or 500 fairly significant book reviews. I'm talking typically 10 to 12 sentences, sometimes a lot more. So we're not just talking about a blurb. Full citing. It's got a fairly robust index, so if you're looking for a specific, category or something you're interested in, state or territory or person or whatnot, it's very user-friendly. I also included in that one a couple of articles Carl wrote about doing some basic research. Carl, a lot of these books are kind of interesting because Carl's one of his big thrusts was that some of the best treasure books out there don't have the word treasure in the top, or in the title rather. So a lot of these books a lot of them are history themed. The idea being that there's lots of clues or lots.
There is a ton of clues and leads in the histories of different towns, different the country, whatever. There's a lot of clues in the history books.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And he covers a huge variety of materials. He does cover some very basic treasure books, and then a huge assortment of different kinds of histories. He focused a lot on different different trails. So, the Chisholm Trail or the Mormon Trail or the Oregon Trail. A lot of books on Ghost Town. A lot of books on, again, you see sort of an arc in his writing. So, like, initially he's writing a lot about treasure, and then he's writing more about history, and then towards the end he's writing a lot about self-sufficiency. So he's writing a lot of books about how to, make your own things, how to make money, how to network with people that make their own money. He was a big proponent of doing what you love and making a living at it. He was also big about what am I thinking of? Killing two birds with one stone. So, he saw a lot of utility in, hey, if you're running a small mining operation, you're running, a dredge or a rocker or whatever, you can do metal detecting. Or if you like to do metal detecting, you can, do ghost towns and then, sell antiques and relics at flea markets or, at the in a spot in an antique store or whatnot. So, so there was a lot of versatility and how do you do the most with what you have. And then again, a lot of books about how do you prepare for upcoming financial struggles and different things like that. Do it yourself kind of stuff. So that's kind of the interesting appeal. When you talk about treasure hunting, that is such a huge umbrella.
Yes. Yes.
Because now you're talking about, coin shooting, or you're talking about cash hunting, or, relic hunting, or rock hounding, even like geocaching now, so there's a lot of different things that sort of fall into that. And then, again, I know, particularly in the western states, that a lot of those hobbies are still fairly pronounced. So the bottom line is there's going to be a lot in this book for a lot of different people. The book, again, I did through CreateSpace. It can be bought directly through CreateSpace, or alternatively through Amazon. Again, if you go to Amazon and you do a search for National Prospectors Gazette, it's going to pop right up. I would encourage.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I would really encourage folks that if you buy the book, by all means, leave a rating or whatnot on Amazon. And the other piece is, and I indicated this earlier, I believe, if you look in the copy, my phone number and my email address are right there. So if you want to talk about the book, or you want to talk about Carl, or you want to talk about Treasure magazines or whatever, I'm always eager to have this conversation. So.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna leave a link here, right here in the description here, to where they can find it on Amazon. So, and with that, Randy, man, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, because I know you are one heck of a researcher, man. You get down and you research every corner, nook, and cranny, and come up with a lot of great things. And that's why I like to listen to you talk, because you come up with a lot of great stuff, a lot of great research. So, thank you.
Oh, I appreciate it. And again, I know you mentioned Ancient Lost Treasures and Treasures of Utah. I can't speak for anybody but that. I know both those forums are still up and running, and we've had a pretty good working relationship between the two forums for a very long time.
Yep.
I'm indebted to you. I'm indebted to Ancient Historical Research Foundation. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book, but also mostly to talk about something that I'm passionate about. And listening to you, I can tell you're passionate about it, and you have done your research. So thank you.